Okay, so we're live. We'll start in a second. We're in a minute. Start screen share. There we go.
Now you're putting that in parallel with a. Okay, so that's okay. You can do that. This is the same. Or you can do it. But there is
Okay, so we're running a little bit late. We'll start in a minute or two.
Was supposed to be Ek het voorgestel hulle 'n onderskeid maak. Dankie.
Okay, right.
So, we'll start with I am going to try to use the mic today. Team, I'm going to try to use the mic today.
Let's see how that works. One issue is whether I am able to consistently speak into the mic. And the other issue is whether pick up on YouTube. So let's just see how it goes. I know I mustn't speak too loudly because it'll bust up the mic system. Okay, hang on. Okay, right. So last time we were looking at arrays, and we actually looked at this little which how to calculate the dot product of two vectors. We need that because the dot product is the sine of the angle between the vectors. That's right. Sine 0, sine 1. So we know what? Cosine. Whatever. One of those. Is it cosine? I believe you, but I thought that the dot product is 1 if the vectors are perpendicular. It's 0 if they're perpendicular. Well, we need that in physics, and apparently you know it. And we do need it in computer graphics. Close the door, please. Close the door, please. Thanks. Okay, right. So we looked at this little example, and then I tried to show you an example of calculating the minimum and maximum of let's just turn that down a little bit. Okay, fine. Then I tried to show you an example of finding the minimum and maximum in an array. And that's something we do so often. It's incredibly important. So let's just see. If there's no feedback, it's not you're not the issue. I am. Let's just see. If I speak softly, I think the feedback will go down. Let's just see quickly how we did that. We have to be very quiet to prevent the feedback. We'll have to be very quiet. Indeed. So we wrote a little program like this to actually read array values from the command line. So the very first thing we did was to read the size. How many elements do we need in the array? I mean, there are other ways of doing it. Instead of doing how many numbers do you want to put in the array and asking for them one by one, I could have done this. I could have used that array initializer to hardcode my array values in the program. But if I send the program to my mother, she don't know Java, she only knows C, she won't know how to hardcode the array values like that. So it's more flexible if we allow the user to type the values. It's even more flexible if we allow the user to put the values in a file that we can read. And we'll get to that soon-ish, 2 weeks time perhaps. But for now, the trade-off between flexibility and convenience, I don't like this. I don't like this feedback. Feedback scares me because you never know when it's going to explode. For now, we'll settle on this compromise that you ask the user how many values can you read in one by one. So we have our first for loop in line 10 that simply walks through all the elements in the array, and for each one it reads the element from the command line. Not from the command line, from standard input. And we give a little prompt so that the user knows what we want them to type. And then we said we are going to guess that the minimum value is the very first value. So the very first value is the smallest, and the very first value is also the biggest, the largest. Which can be true in one special circumstance when all the values are equal. If all the values are equal, then the very first value will be equal to the minimum and the maximum in the array. But if they're not, if there's only one value even that's different in the array, different from the first, then that value will either be bigger than or smaller than the very first element in the array, the very first value in the array. And so the first element cannot possibly be both the minimum or the maximum. That other value that's different from the very first will be either bigger, in which case it could be the maximum, or it's smaller, in which case it could be the minimum. Okie dokie, so we guess that it's the first one, but if we're wrong, this for loop is going to correct it. So we have this for loop, it walks through the whole array, and it checks each element, AI. So element number I. Are you smaller than the minimum? Are you smaller than my minimum? If so, I need to update. Oh, I hate this feedback. And I do something wrong. Donna never has issues. Let's just see. If this element is smaller than the minimum, I have to update the minimum because I found a new minimum. I found a new AI that's smaller than min. So I update and I put AI in min in the same format. And this is perfect, except for one small issue, and that is that my for loop starts at 0. So I'm looking at the very first element again. But we know that for A0, it cannot be smaller than the minimum because we start off by saying the minimum is exactly equal to A0. And the same for max. A0 won't be bigger than max because we say that max is equal to A0 before we start. So for the very first element, just for A0, these two tests are useless. They won't ever be true. Min is already equal to A0, max is already equal to A0. So usually we skip them. So I start my for loop at 1 instead of 0. I don't have to look at the first element again. Start by looking at the second element and see if it's actually a new minimum or a new maximum. Carry on like that. I thought hard about trying to find an example where I can make some mistake that no one will notice, so that I can show you how to debug your code. Because you're going to write code like this, I'm sure you have it, and you're going to execute it and it's not going to work. It doesn't produce the right answer. How do you know what's going on? Well, the first thing to do is fix your indentation, please. Because it could be a mistake with what goes where, and if you're not indenting properly, you might see a mistake. The second thing is just to look at your code. Sometimes you look at code and you spot a mistake that you've made. Reading through it and saying, like, what does this do? What am I doing here? Why am I doing this? What's this order of sort 1? Is that really correct? Should this be I less than or equal to k? Or is it correct if it's less than k? But if all of that fails, I want to see what my program is doing. So one try and test technique is to add debugging. You have a bug in your program, we want to debug it. So we add debugging to code. And debugging statements aren't anything special, they're simply extra print lines or prints that I add to tell me what the program is doing as it is executing. So I'm going to make a mistake. I'm going to make a mistake by saying that's greater than is going to be a less than. Now, except apart from the name, max and min, the code for max is exactly the same as the code for min. I start off by assigning A0 to max. I check if AI is less than max. If so, I'll take max. So in the end, I expect max to be the same value as min. Just because it's called max doesn't mean anything.